just going to dim the lights. Don't worry.
Okay, hello everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming. It's lovely to see so many people here to an event that celebrates the People's Friend, which is the subject of my PhD research for the next 3 years. So thank you very much for coming. As we've heard from Margaret, really wonderfully, the creation of the People's Friend in 1869 was a deliberate step towards encouraging the literary pursuits of working class Scots. In its first issue, the magazine stated its desire to be a periodical for all working class men and women, and the Friend was deliberately a magazine for all the family. It was rooted in the idea of the household at the centre, and its well-known golden rule that nothing in the columns would corrupt the morals of either old or young. However, the People's Friend that we know today is definitely a women's magazine and the longest running in the world. So where did this female identity come from, and how can we trace its development between the beginning of the People's Friend and 1900? Well, we can start with this man. This is John Lang, as Margaret mentioned. And he was the owner and the creator of the People's Friend and the Liberal MP for Dundee between 1889 and 1905. Lang arrived in Dundee in 1855 as the newly appointed editor and managing director of the Dundee Advertiser, and he was tasked with widening the Advertiser's circulation, raising its profits, and generally making it a better paper. And he seemed to be a much nicer man than his very serious portrait on the right. On the left is actually a portrait that's in the McManus Gallery in Dundee, and the little sort of, I don't really know what it is, but the silver thing that's in the box was actually a gift that was donated by the Advertiser's office. So all the staff chipped in and they gave that to him. Lang was an industrious editor, and from 1858 onwards he established a series of popular newspapers and magazines which dominated the periodical press in Dundee in the late 19th century, and this included the People's Friend in 1869. And it should be noted that it wasn't until 1905 that D.C. Thompson and John Lang's companies merged. So in this period that I'm talking about, roughly 1869 to 1905, the People's Friend is a Lang newspaper or a Lang magazine, not a D.C. Thompson one. So according to Lang, his intentions for the People's Friend were quite clear. He said, "I want the People's Friend to be a friend of the mothers, wives, daughters and bairns of Scotland. And I want it to be largely written by women, for women, and by good women who make other women good." Now this quotation was actually recollected by a member of the People's Friend staff in 1938, and therefore I don't know exactly when Lang said this, or if he said it at all. But the general sentiment is quite clear. Women have always had an important association with the People's Friend that was at least attributed to the view of its original proprietor. So if the intention was for a female-friendly magazine, what kind of content was being published that attracted female readers to the People's Friend? Well, in its first year, 1869, the Friend was issued as a monthly magazine, and a feature that attracted considerable attention was the column The Housewife, which you can find in your little supplement on the chairs. And this was an early format of the knitting patterns, recipes and household tips that we associate with the Friend today. In the columns, the housewife wrote about a variety of female-orientated subjects, and these were about women entering workplaces and becoming independent beings in the modern world. A particular article that raised some interest was one about medical graduates, female medical graduates, and the difficulties that they faced when they graduated and started looking for a job as a doctor. And in The Housewife, it stated that women are quite as industrious as men and are able to compete with them in any field, and in some they have even proven themselves to be cleverer than men. So first wave feminism was quite alive and well in the editorials of the Friend in 1869. However, 1870 marked a slight change for the People's Friend. It became a weekly magazine, and it drew the need for a bigger literary staff and more content to fill the pages. The Housewife column was expanded, it became a full page, and it was altered slightly. Its subject matter was no longer as explicitly feminist, but it was redesigned to provide, and I quote from the screen, a few plain hints which, if acted upon, may assist mothers whose own domestic training may have been defective in imparting useful introduction to their daughters. And I quite like that because it's quite harsh and quite severe, but quite hopeful. So domestic training became the new focus for female readers of The Friend, and subsequent articles from the housewife were titled Thoughtfulness in Children, An Orderly House, Cleanliness in the Home, and so on. So even though this version of the housewife was far more domestic by modern standards today, we can still view this as evidence of female empowerment in the 19th century. The Friend provided a space for women, and it encouraged women to sit down, to take time for themselves, and to seek help, advice, and share their experiences of work, family life, and household management. In the 1880s, The Friend developed its household pages to encourage this kind of narrative. The household page adopted a motto, keep thy household and thy household will keep thee. And illustrations such as these on the screen show women shopping, working, cooking, and these developed quite regularly alongside the household column. And even though these women here in these illustrations are doing things that we might consider domestic or servient, they all have a purpose and they're independent to some extent, and we can find representation of this purpose in the pages of The People's Friend. So by 1900, the housewife had a name and a face. She was known by the pseudonym Jeanette, and that's her there on the right. Jeanette was the household editor of The Friend, and she became the personification of The Friend's idealised good woman. Jeanette promoted household order, good etiquette, and ladylike manners. And her household pages were also interactive, as Margaret said. Women could write to Jeanette with their worries, they could ask advice, or for cooking recipes or cleaning tips, and they would receive a response in the column that was organised by Jeanette. So we can consider her an early version of an agony aunt that's quite common in magazines nowadays. And Jeanette's reply here is quite typical of her opinion. She says that women need leisure time just as much as their children do, and then she invites readers of The Friend to respond to this and provide some sort of debate in the next issue. This image of Jeanette is actually taken from a postcard that was sent to Belgium in 1905. It was part of a marketing campaign by The Friend to promote Jeanette and the magazine's household pages. In part, it was motivated by how popular she had become, and an image like this one of the photograph was printed in the pages of The People's Friend also. And just to provide a bit of context, there were many versions of these kinds of household editors in women's magazines and newspapers in the late 19th century in Britain. Sticking with Dundee, in Dundee, the Dirty Courier, which was a D.C. Thompson paper in this period, not a Lang paper, they had their own version of Jeanette. She was imaginatively named Annette, who provided similar commentary in the pages of the Courier. In the Evening Telegraph, which was a Lang newspaper, there was a regular ladies' column known as Letter to the Ladies, which first appeared in 1879 and was then written by contributors using a variety of random female pseudonyms, including Sheila, Deborah, Vera, and Marguerite. Now, Marguerite, in the Evening Telegraph, was the most consistent correspondent between 1882 and 1907, and her articles were on similar subjects to that of Jeanette's. After some research, I'm quite happy to discover and reveal that Jeanette of The People's Friend and Marguerite of the Evening Telegraph was the same woman. That woman on that photograph there. So I can now put a name to the face, and that name is Jessie M. King, and that's her there. So Jessie was born in 1862 in Bankfoot, Perthshire, and she was educated at her local parish school, and she was also a niece of the local Perthshire Advertiser, a niece of the editor of the Perthshire Advertiser. As a teenager, she began winning prizes for essays that she submitted to Church of Scotland literary competitions, so she was right up French Street. In 1881, aged just only 18, she was hired by John Lang to the staff of the Evening Telegraph as its female correspondent after submitting a poem to The People's Friend, and she moved all the way to Dundee to begin work for John Lang. Whilst in Dundee, she attended night classes in English composition and rhetoric at University College, now University of Dundee, and she came top of her year. She actually beat fellow future journalists, James Buchan, who became the music critic of the Dundee Courier, and she beat David Pay, who became the future editor of the People's Friend.
David Pay's daughter is Josie Margaret, and I probably have to just...
There you go. This is the great-granddaughter of David Pay sitting here, Judith, so she's definitely got a lot of info. Jessie was always also deeply interested in political and temperance movements. She was a co-founder of the Dundee Women's Liberal Association, and she held an office for the British Women's Temperance Association. These positions and her work in Lyme's newspapers often took her to Europe. In 1889, she was at the Eiffel Tower exhibition in Paris, and in 1897, she attended the International Women's Congress in Berlin. Jessie was known as the pioneer female journalist, and the People's Friend claimed her as the first female journalist hired in Scotland. In 1937, for the 60th anniversary of the Evening Telegraph, Jessie contributed an editorial to the paper that reflected on her identity as a pioneer. She said, "To be a pioneer has its difficulties, but it also has its compensations. I was a novelty and a popular novelty." So Jessie was certainly a popular novelty as a full-time female journalist in Scotland. Even in the 1880s and 1890s, as women became an important commercial market for magazines and newspapers, it was still men who held the senior positions in journalism. However, a genre of magazine culture where women were well represented and could earn a decent living was in fiction. By the 1890s, serialised fiction was the mainstay of the Friend's content. Weekly serials kept readers interested and crucially kept them buying issues, which still happens today. The Friend's most well-known female author is probably Annie S. Swan. However, another popular writer who preceded Swan and held a prominent position in the pages of the Friend was Adeline Sargent. And this is Adeline. She was born in Derbyshire in England in 1851, and she had an early interest in writing that was encouraged by her mother, who also wrote verse and short stories. However, after her father and mother's deaths, she became a teacher in order to bring in a regular income. After many years of struggling and writing by herself, she entered a competition that was organised by the People's Friend in 1881. They were trying to find their new serial for 1881. She won the competition and £100, and her serial novel Jacoby's Wife was published in The Friend in 1882. After seeking advice from the People's Friend editor, she was hired to the staff of the People's Friend, and she moved up from England to Dundee to live, work and write in the city. And in Dundee she had quite a successful career. She wrote more than 30 novels, many of which appeared in the serials as serials in The Friend, and her stories were typical of the kind of literature that The Friend was looking to publish in the 1880s and 1890s. Her stories were about strong female protagonists who overcame difficult circumstances, but ultimately remained honest, good and respectable women. And like Jessie M. King, Adeline was interested in promoting women's rights. She was described as being deeply interested in the position of women, the spread of socialism, the education of women, and the condition of the labouring classes. And in Dundee, she was part of the Dundee Literary Society, and back in London, she was a member of the Liberal Women's Suffrage Association. Before her death, Adeline was interviewed about her career in The Friend. She said, "I was not successful at first. I wrote little stories for magazines and a child's book or two, but I had no success at all. In 1880, I competed for a prize of £100 offered by the People's Friend, and I have kept up my connection with this paper ever since. And I am always grateful to the editor for the help he gave me at a critical time." The Friend was essential in launching Adeline's career when she was a struggling writer, and as she said, Adeline remained a faithful servant to the Friend and was a well-liked member of the staff during her time. How am I doing for time? So the last contributor that I want to discuss is Aunt Kate. So Aunt Kate was launched as the household editor for the People's Journal, which was Lyme's popular weekly newspaper. She was similar to Jeanette in the People's Friend, and by 1902, Aunt Kate had become a regular caricature in the journal of domestic goodness, and penny handbooks that were written under the name Aunt Kate became incredibly popular throughout Scotland. And these are two examples. They don't have a date in them, but I think they're from 1896, maybe 1897. The one on the left, a book of etiquette, and the one on the right, Aunt Kate's letter writer. So these handbooks were on every kind of household and domestic topic you could think of, and they symbolise everything that the middle class and aspirational working class young women might need to know about life in the early 1900s. We also have, well, I've given you here a couple of examples in the 20th century. So the one on, I've done them the wrong way around. The one on the left is from the 1940s, but the one on the right is actually from the 1920s, from 1929. So there was considerable overlap between Aunt Kate in the People's Journal, but also in the People's Friend. So she wasn't necessarily a People's Friend contributor, but as you can see on the left hand side of the book there, it says presented with the People's Friend. So there was some sort of cross-contamination. And Aunt Kate was big business for the People's Friend. In 1924, the John Lyne Company, who still owned Aunt Kate, went to court to stop an Edinburgh food company known as Aunt Kate's Food Company using the name Aunt Kate, which they claimed to have the rights to. And also in the court notes for the trial, they described Aunt Kate as a fictitious person. However, Aunt Kate was a real woman. Between 1920 and 1970, roughly, the Aunt Kate columns in the People's Friend and the People's Journal were written by Flora Scrimger. And that's Flora on the right. So Flora was from a wealthy and prominent Dundee family known as the Scrimgers, and by the 1920s there was a Scrimger in every aspect of Dundee public life, and especially in Dundee journalism. Not pictured here, but part of Flora's extended family. Her aunt, Frances Scrimger, had been a well-known journalist for the Dundee Courier. Her uncle, Norval Scrimger, wrote a regular column for the Sunday Post. And her father, George, who's the man in the centre, he became Provost of Newport-on-Tay, and he was also the author of the Here and There column in the Evening Telegraph for about 40 years, as far as I can see. Her father and her other uncles, which included Edwin Scrimger, the Prohibitionist MP in Dundee, they owned and edited the popular satirical magazine The Piper of Dundee between 1886 and 1906. So after education at the High School of Dundee, Flora became part of this prominent journalistic family. She was a long-time member of the Newport Literary Society, and she began writing poetry in the People's Friend in 1918, which is how I found her and sort of did a bit of research on. And I think it's from this contact, writing in the People's Friend, but also being part of that kind of world of newspaper and journalism, newspapers and journalism in Dundee, that she was hired as Aunt Kate, and it was a position she held for more than 50 years. And hopefully I'm going to try and speak to her great niece in the next couple of weeks and see if I can get some more information there. So time for conclusion, I think. At the outset, I asked how we can trace the evolution of the Friend from its beginnings as a Victorian literary periodical to an international women's magazine. Well, from what I've discussed, I hope we can see that the work and careers of these three women helped the People's Friend transition into a women's magazine. Each of these women were prolific writers, they contributed regularly to the People's Friend, and they led independent lives that characterised their literature. And they were all involved in aspects of Dundee literary and civic life, local politics, and the advancement of women's rights at the turn of the 20th century, when the woman question was becoming an issue of national importance. And I think it's clear to see that their activities and their lives permeated the pages of the Friend between 1869 and the 1920s. However, these women are quite unique, and they're not very typical of the kinds of people or the kinds of women that were reading the People's Friend. They are part of a much broader new wave of female journalists, writers and editors who were entering the popular press and receiving notoriety in the 1880s throughout Scotland, Britain, Ireland and America. These women here were not ordinary working class women like the ones who actually bought and read the People's Friend. They were from middle class families, educated backgrounds, and they were largely financially independent. They were also writing for women with families, husbands, and real responsibilities. However, Adeline and Frances never married or had children, and Jessie M. King married at the age of 45 and then promptly gave up life as a journalist. So although these women represent the spirit of female independence and empowerment that the People's Friend promoted in its early years, they aren't very representative of the mill girls, domestic servants, and working women who were undoubtedly the most important readership for the People's Friend by the 1890s. But they do represent the first generation of female journalists in the popular press in Dundee, and they show the importance of the female narrative to the People's Friend. So I think to end quite quickly here, we go from illustrations like this in 1885, features a male newspaper boy selling copies of the People's Friend in the street. But by 1905, we've got a very genteel woman posting a letter to the People's Friends. And these both come from the People's Friends art department, and they're sort of typical of this transition from very working class Victorian paper to middle class women's magazine. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes, hi. No. I know. I thought I was going to be the same woman, but it's not the same woman.